Okay, welcome to Flipping the Classroom AP style. Again, this is going to be a let's see how it goes type of thing. We'll do most of the first unit and check back. I can't stress enough how important it is to take your notes, write questions, and certain times I'll say we'll talk about this in class or make sure that you make notes for this and we'll bring it to class. But anytime you have problems with the class, the lectures, you can always tweet it, or you can bring it to class and we can talk about it. All right. So let's start off. Constitutional underpinnings is the first unit. Democracy in the United States is our first go. Try it. So, democracy. Democracy is rule by the people. There are two types. This is pretty straightforward stuff. Direct, ruled by the people themselves, and indirect, a representative, ruled by elected representatives. So the founders distrusted direct democracy. It was really impractical. I mean, the colonies were spread out. It isn't, they couldn't just drive somewhere. It took a long time to get places. There wasn't the high degree of education by everyone, so they figured that it's better to elect people that kind of do this stuff, politicians or the intelligentsia. All right, and then the fleeting passions of the people. They were worried that some popular person who espoused some sort of thing would win the election, and then terrible things would happen, and then this person wouldn't be qualified to run the country. So, a republic is the same as indirect democracy. So, yes, we do have a republic. Solves the problem of direct democracy while securing the advantages of direct democracy while curing the weaknesses. Okay, so again, the chance for the people to elect someone to represent them. Better chance to have someone reasonable. So let's switch gears and talk about democratic theory a little bit. There's a few different views of democratic theory. The first being a majoritarian politics view. Leaders are heavily influenced by the will of the people. I think you can see that played out a little bit when you see politicians respond to polls, or there's polling where they ask people what they think about this, that, or the other thing. The second is elite politics view, with minorities, and not minorities in the sense that you think of them, black, Hispanic, etc., but small parties, small groups of people. They dominate policymaking. And underneath that, a few people talked about those. Marx talked about the influence of economic elites. Marx, of course, famous for his socialist doctrine. C. Wright Mills talked about the power elite, whether that be corporate, military, or political. A very famous speech as Eisenhower was ready to leave office after 8 years as president. He talked about the military-industrial complex and to be afraid of that military-industrial complex. That would be the Boeings of the world, Rockwell, and what I used whatnot. There you go. So next is Max Weber, the influence of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy being those peoples and institutions that help run our government. And he thought that those were very important because they essentially dealt with the day-to-day, the things that when you deal with the government, you basically deal with the monopoly, or I'm sorry, with the bureaucracy, rather. Okay? The next is pluralist view. Pluralist. Anyway, political resources are so scattered that no monopoly has a single elite has a monopoly on them. So, in other words, there are all sorts of different types of groups at play. There are so many institutions in which power is exercised that no single elite could possibly control them all. Imagine if you are a company, you have to deal with maybe perhaps Department of Energy and the FAA, or all of a sudden you're dealing with 5 or 6 different organizations. Remember to take a look at up the front of my whiteboard. I have a sheet that shows you how many organizations are all under the domain of the Homeland Security. All right. Pluralism therefore argues that many groups compete with each other for control over policy. Policy is therefore the outcome of political haggling, innumerable compromises, and ever-shifting alliances among groups. Kind of makes a little bit of a sense, doesn't it? Especially in our world. And then the hyper-pluralist view is that pluralism gone sour. There are so many groups, and they're so strong that government has become gridlocked and is unable to act. Now, I would argue that perhaps our government has become gridlocked. Not sure if it's because of those groups, but rather a Congress that seems to be dysfunctional. Okay? Fundamental democratic values. So the first among those is popular sovereignty. Okay? The second is respect for the individual. State serves individuals, not vice versa. So the idea that the government works for you, you don't work for the government. Liberty. I don't think anything needs to be said there. And equality. Now, it's more equality of opportunity than result. Equality of result would lead to more like a socialist state or a imagined socialist state. But we're talking about equality of opportunity. And one could argue that that doesn't necessarily exist either in this country. Then you also talk about the role of FDR's Second Bill of Rights, talking about economic security, you know, the Social Security and those types of things. Next, fundamental democratic processes. So how do you get a democratic society? You need these fundamental types of processes. Free and fair elections is the most important, with competing political parties. Now, the founders didn't think, okay, well, we need Democrats and we need Republicans. They just assumed that there would be competing parties. I'm not even sure that they thought that there would be just two competing parties. And certainly if you look in places in Europe where there's all sorts of different types of democracies, it doesn't need to be a two-party system. There's a lot of countries that have more than that. Okay? Majority rule with minority rights. The rights being, you know, they have a say in how policy is created. There was certainly a fear of the tyranny of the majority, so it led to the protection of property rights and other things. Freedom of expression is extremely important. And the right to assemble and protest, obviously. So you see those things carried out in our Bill of Rights, very much evident and present in our society. Fundamental democratic structures. We'll talk about this later. As a side note, every time you see a word bolded, that's a word that shows up in the AP test often. So pay attention to those. Make sure you know what they are. Federalism, okay, strong central government. Separation of powers and checks and balances. We talked a little bit about those in class already. They are different. Make sure you understand the difference in them. And then constitutionalism, you know, following a constitution and having it be the backbone of what you do and how you do it. Okay? Moving on. Origins of the American Republic. Okay, so let's talk about the sources of the Constitution. It didn't just appear out of thin air. You know, just like you and I, we try to steal the best ideas of others and meld them into what is useful for us. So, British customs and traditions, the Magna Carta and English Bill of Rights are certainly very important. The philosophers at the time, this was a time of enlightenment in Europe for a couple centuries, and there was a whole host of philosophers and political thinkers of the time, among them John Locke, Hobbes, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. We'll cover them briefly, I believe, in a short little activity that we're going to do. They're very important to understand. If you really want to get into them, take a poli-sci class in college, a theory class. They're fascinating people. They wrote about amazing things. So, colonial experiences. For example, the power of the purse was held by the elected assembly. So this idea that the assembly can spend money for the common good, collect and spend money. And state constitutions written after the Declaration of Independence, for example, the preamble closely resembles the introduction to the Massachusetts Constitution. Next, Constitutional Convention of 1787. So a little bit of background there. We talked about the Declaration of Independence, the breakup letter. Then we had the Revolutionary War till 83. Under those, the Articles of Confederation were in operation, but it had a weak central government. And really, for the most part, what they're concerned about during the war was the war. And it was easy to gather the people together, united in a fight with Washington as the strong military leader. But the problems with the Articles of Confederation were there. They didn't state any power to tax. There was no chief executive, nobody to kind of make sure everything was run properly. No national judiciary. No power to regulate interstate or foreign commerce, and then no national currency. Okay, those were very big. Imagine if you take away all of those today, we would have a useless government. All right. Annapolis Convention of 1786 was called to improve the Articles. And then in 1786 as well, you had Shays' Rebellion. And this was up in Massachusetts. A group thought they didn't like being taxed and other types of things they thought the government was doing poorly. And so they were going to gather people together and fight and go after the guns. And the Continental Army was called back together, some of them, and they put that down. But it led to, obviously, showing that maybe we need a stronger national government. The delegates to the convention, this is a often quoted characteristic of them: well-read, well-bred, well-fed, and well-wed. Okay, so imagine white, middle-aged, landowning, wealthy men who went to college, probably. So those were the people making the decisions. Participants: Madison, the father of the Constitution, because of his leadership, and he took detailed notes. So he didn't come up with all the ideas. That's often a misconception, or when you say father, you think that he did it all. He really was just kind of a strong leader there. He was the organizer. He took notes about it. He wrote about it. And so people looked to him for his leadership. Okay, Washington was the presiding officer, strong man, people respected and loved. Franklin was the elder statesman. He often just sat there listening, perhaps falling asleep, but he was very old. He'd die a few years later. Morris, largely responsible for final wording of the Constitution, and Hamilton, most forceful advocate for a strong central government, or what we'd call the Federalists. Okay? Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the U.S. in 1913 stated the Constitution was written by the propertied class, so it naturally reflected those interests. Now, there's been arguments since then and since then, that most people owned property, so even if you were not very well educated, you might live out in the boonies, you moved out and you owned property. There wasn't a large lower class that worked for others. There certainly was, and in the South we would refer to those as slaves, but most people owned some property of one sort or another. Even the poor, in hopes of someday owning property, wanted to protect property. So again, that's kind of one of those ideas that is still alive today, that the poor sometimes support policy that doesn't necessarily go in their interests, because of this idea that maybe one day they will have more money or be more established. And then establishing democratic government involved risks and dangers, so you need to build in safeguards and protections. So those are the arguments against this economic interpretation. So we get to the Constitution. Areas of agreement, things that they all kind of said, okay, here's what we need to do to take care of this. We need to scrap the Articles of Confederation. They're not working, as we talked about earlier. Make sure you refer back to that list of why those things cause the Articles not to work. And they establish a Republican government, a constitutional government. So they want to make sure that it's electorates. We talked about both those things already, right? You need a good, strong constitution, and you need elected representatives. They established a balanced government where no single interest dominated. Again, this idea of different factions was very much a big concern for the constitutional founders, and they wanted to make sure that no power was not held in one body alone. Okay. Suffrage for property owners only. So again, voting only for property owners. Stronger central government than under the Articles. Protection of property rights. The main purpose of government is to protect property rights. Again, take yourself back. You're a property owner. You want to make sure that, going forward, you set up a government that's going to help you hold on to what you have. And they wanted to keep the proceedings secret. Now, they didn't do this out of any big fear of espionage or anything. What they wanted to do is make sure that they could have these discussions and figure this out without it leaking out, and that would cause the population, the public, to react one way or another all the time. They needed to just get this done in secrecy without the distractions. So imagine trying to do this today and having somebody tweeting and Facebooking all these things, and the reactions back and forth and back and forth. They wouldn't be able to hammer these things out. Now you could argue there was a simpler time back then. It certainly was, but they knew that they didn't need a bunch of debate. Okay, the selling of the Constitution would come later. Areas of disagreement that led to compromises. So the first amongst those was representation among the states. How do you get these 13 states equally represented or fairly represented in this new national government? Okay, so the large states favored the Virginia plan. So it's based on population, which makes sense. I'm a large state, I got a lot of people, I want to have more power. Okay? The small states favored the New Jersey plan, which called for equal representation, which makes sense if you're a small state. No, I want to have just as much power as we can. So they called it the Connecticut or Great Compromise. It's most often referred to as the Great Compromise. So make sure you understand that. Again, it's in bolded letters. It calls for a bicameral legislature with popularly elected House based on population, okay, which looks like the Virginia plan. And then a Senate with equal representation elected by state legislatures, which looks like the New Jersey plan. So they're able to appease both. All right, so next comes representation, taxation of slaves. So the northern states wanted slaves to count for taxation, but not representation. So they didn't want more people from the South to be in the House. They just wanted their money. So southern states wanted obviously just the exact opposite. So they came up with what was called the Three-Fifths Compromise. It's probably one of those dark times in American history. We look back and we think, how could they have ever thought about it and done this? But basically says that a slave was 3/5 of a person. So not even a person. In fact, they were property. Again, we're not going to hash this out. I think we can all agree that this was a terrible time in American history, hopefully never to be repeated. So slaves would count for both 3/5. They would count for equal representation among northern and southern states. Okay. Election of the president. Life term versus annual election. So life term sounds a lot like a king. They weren't very keen on that, and they didn't really think that an annual election would be very wise. It would take a lot of time. Imagine trying to have an election every year. Now it would seem impossible. Back then, it just seemed impractical. So they compromised with a 4-year term. So how would you vote? How would you elect them? So this led to some other talk. Some wanted election by Congress. Some wanted election by state legislatures. Some wanted direct election. And so they compromised and had the electoral college system in which you voted, but essentially you vote for someone to then vote. And we'll talk about the electoral college system later. Not to worry about it right at this moment. Just make sure that you understand it was part of the compromise in the Constitution. So, ratification politics. So, how do you get this Constitution ratified? So, Federalists were very much supporters of this. Well, they were all supporters, but their supporters, property owners, creditors, and merchants. So, Federalists were property owners, creditors, and merchants. So, their views were that elites are the most fit to govern. Well, look at who that is, property owners, creditors, and merchants. Okay, they feared the excesses of democracy, and they favored a strong central government. Okay, all things we've talked about already. Leaders were Hamilton, Madison, Washington, and Jay. So, the Anti-Federalists, their supporters were small farmers, frontiersmen, debtors, and shopkeepers. Okay, so small-time business owners, and then the rural. So think of it as city versus rural, if you will. Not all, nothing is absolute, but it's a good organizational way of thinking about it. So, their views. They feared the concentration of power in the hands of the elites. They believed that government should be closer to the people. They feared a strong central government. They favored strong state governments. A lot of these people were from the South, not all of them. Feared strong central government, and then feared the lack of a Bill of Rights. So that was their strongest argument. And their leaders were Henry, Mason, and Gary. So, the Federalists' advantages were that they were better represented in state legislatures, they controlled the press, and they began ratification procedures right away, and before Anti-Federalists could get organized. And they also took away the biggest part that the Anti-Federalists wanted. They agreed to the Bill of Rights after ratification of the Constitution. So they said, you can have this Bill of Rights, but it has to happen after we ratify the Constitution. And if you look at who supported it, and then we talked about the Federalist Papers were written anonymously. They were published anonymously, so people didn't know who was writing them. And they were all in support of the Constitution. And we'll take a look at the Federalist Papers. We'll spend some time in them. The writers of those, though, were Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. And those were purely to rally support for ratification. So they'd bring up arguments about this, that, or the other thing, and then write essays about them. Ratification in 1788 by the state ratifying conventions of popularly elected delegates. All right, so gets it done. Principles of the Constitution, in no particular order, so we're just going to attack them. Separation of powers. To Madison, tyranny was government that controlled all 3 branches of government. So they needed a division of power among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. So they want to diffuse power instead of concentrating power. And this clearly was the influence of Montesquieu, which again, we'll take a look at Montesquieu in class a little bit more. Colonial experiences, for example, excessive power in state legislatures, so they needed a strong central executive branch. So their experiences were that the legislatures in the states were way too powerful. Okay, and then the danger of one branch combining forces with another branch. So that led to concern and then the implementation of checks and balances. So separation of powers is about this branch has, these powers, they're responsible for this, this, and this. And this, then checks and balances is these things help us control the power of these other branches. So the background, the 18th century view of government as something to be restrained, compared to the modern view of government as something to be used for the common good. Again, they feared government because the only governments that they knew, the tyranny of the king, and then some of these state legislatures that were all powerful. And fear and tyranny among founders. So this distrust of government, checks and balances, as a means of intentionally building inefficiency in order to prevent government abuse of power. So they intentionally put passing laws and these types of things as very difficult to do, and taking a long time, because they thought that that process would kind of diffuse power. It wouldn't be just one person saying, oh, we're going to do this and we're going to do this. Okay? So system of restraints in which each branch can check the other two reflects that fear of tyranny. For example, here are just some checks and balances things. Veto, veto override, appointment and then confirmation, treaty making and then ratification, defense funding, and the role of the president as commander-in-chief. So power check, power check. And then there's political independence within each branch. No branch is dependent upon the other two for election, with the exception of a lot of judges being appointed by the president and confirmed by Congress. But once that happens, they operate independently. The only issue, and we'll get to this when we get into the institutions unit, is funding for these courts. And then continuance in office, life terms for judges. Staggering of terms within each branch. A majority of voters can gain control over one part of government at one time. So what we have this year is midterm elections, which is 2 years after a president, and these generally swing back in favor of the party that wasn't elected president, because it's a natural response by the people. Okay. Modifications of checks and balances. Examine if the following strengthen or weaken checks and balances. Do political parties strengthen or weaken checks and balances? In theory, they should weaken checks and balances as a way of bringing the branches of government together. However, the Constitution divides government. Parties bring bring people together in government. So, however, parties are weak, and they're getting weaker and weaker. Dominance of only two parties. Each party has a wide range of interests. Much disagreement within each party itself. And, so take a look at, the Republican or Democratic Party, they kind of swing. Now it's the Republicans are very, very wide spectrum of ideas and thoughts. 20 years ago, it was Democrats that were very widely diffused. Okay? So it led to the prevalence of divided government. For example, president of one party, Congress of the other, which we essentially have right now. Not completely, but close enough. Changes in voting methods. Senators are now chosen by the people. They were chosen by the state legislatures for over 100 years. Congressmen are chosen by the people, and presidents chosen by electors who vote as the people have voted. We'll talk about that again later. So members of two branches essentially chosen by the same electorate, which weakens the checks and balances in theory. However, split ticket voting has changed this, so the idea that I can vote for a president of one party and a congressperson of another, or a senator of another. Okay, so I don't have to vote purely one party or the other. And then the growth of the federal bureaucracy, development of numerous agencies with legislative, executive, and judicial functions. So what happens is Congress grants broad authority to these agencies and lets them carry out the general will of Congress. For example, Congress established the IRS to collect taxes, then granted the IRS authority to help write the tax code, enforce the tax code, and settle disputes. So write law, do the executive functions of the law, and settle them, and so decide in a judiciary form what happens. So the growth of bureaucracy has caused a weakening of checks and balances. Changes in technology. For example, nukes, computers, fax machines, satellite, these things all change the power of, for example, the president. So the President, Congress, interest groups have all been able to take advantage of these new technologies. So they strengthen checks and balances. The President has been especially able to take advantage of these. The President has this ability. For instance, as I'm taping this today, the President will be speaking tonight, and all the major networks will cover him, because he said, I want to speak to everybody. So if John Boehner, Representative Boehner, House Speaker Boehner, said, I want to speak to the people, yeah, maybe some people would cover it. They'd probably put it on the news, but he can't ask the networks for time. One could make the argument he could ask Fox News, and they'd give it to him. But all right. So, and then the emergency of the U.S. as a world power. There are a lot of areas of national interests extended around the world. With such heavy responsibility as is, any crisis seems to involve the U.S. Somehow around the world. So they need to be dealt with in a strong and efficient manner. Things happen very quickly. So the power is concentrated in the executive branch, weakening checks and balances. Limited government. The dilemma of wanting a more effective government, but also a limited government that did not become tyrannical. Okay, everybody wants an effective government. Constitutional government. Government has only those powers listed in the Constitution. So the argument is, don't overstep what you can do. If it's not in the Constitution, you can't do it. However, Constitution is broadly written. So the Bill of Rights is a safeguard against possible tyranny from a new, strong, distant government. Little fear of state governments, great fear of the national governments. Therefore, it brings in Amendment 10, that reflects the view that states would have substantial powers. Central government could exercise only those powers delegated to it by the Constitution. States would have all other powers. Free elections, but potential of majority faction. So Madison's auxiliary precautions. Okay. Judicial review, the power of courts to strike down laws or governmental actions. So these aren't explicitly provided for in the Constitution, but Constitution is written in broad terms, as we discussed. So they, somebody has to interpret the Constitution, and that fell onto the courts, and it was established in the very famous Supreme Court case of Marbury versus Madison. So kind of the facts of the case, background. So we had the end of the Federalist control of government, an appointment of midnight judges. So Jefferson wants to appoint all these judges before his term runs out, including a guy named Marbury. So Jefferson ordered Madison to not deliver commissions to these judges. I might have said Jefferson. I didn't mean Jefferson. Jefferson is anti-federalist. I meant Madison. To not deliver these commissions to the judges, but Marbury wanted to be a judge, so he requested a writ of mandamus, which was allowed under Section 13 of the Judicial Act of 1789. He asked for this from the Supreme Court to order the delivery of his commission. He wanted to be this judge. Okay, so decision of John Marshall in the court said that this Section 13 of the Judiciary Act was unconstitutional. Okay, so Marbury didn't get to be a judge. So this is the kind of the funny part. So the analysis, and when we take a look at what happened here, Marshall ruled that the court did not have the authority to issue this writ. But he paradoxically increased its power by establishing the fact that he got to decide whether or not they could do this, which was called judicial review. So he ended up saying the Supreme Court has to look at this, gets to decide whether it's constitutional or not, and guess what? It's not constitutional. So Madison doesn't get what he wants, and Jefferson really doesn't get what he wants, because he ended up allowing the court to have more power than he really wanted it. So the power here is that the citizens can change the constitutionality of laws, and we'll look at Gideon versus Wainwright later in our institutions unit. But litigation has become an important way of making public policy. And we have so many examples in our history recently of that. Changing the Constitution informally, i.e. without adding amendments. So the Constitution remembers a framework with details to be filled in as you move along, society changes. So due to the difficulties of formally changing the Constitution, informal ways have been developed. First, you can have acts of Congress, like the Judiciary Act. You can have judicial rulings, which interpret the Constitution, or things like Plessy-Ferguson, Brown Board of Education, Again, we'll talk about those later. Presidential actions. For example, police actions since World War II. You know, we haven't declared war on a single country since December 8th, 1941. Executive privilege or impoundment, and we'll talk about those later. No need to worry about what they are right now. Customs and traditions, for example, the cabinet, political parties, committee system in Congress, all those things, these things aren't in the Constitution. They've just been added. And the Constitution belongs to the living, not the dead, is what Jefferson said. So they understood that the Constitution would change and adapt to the world changing and adapting around them. And Jefferson actually believed the Constitution, each generation may need a new Constitution. It hasn't occurred because the informal changes allowed the Constitution to adapt to the new societies. Changing the Constitution formally, called adding amendments. So you need a unanimous vote to amend, which was impractical. So they needed to make the process easier, but not too easy. So it reflects the federal system. And it's a two-step system of proposal and ratification. So proposal, 2/3 vote from both Congresses. All have been done this way. No presidential veto possible. Constitutional convention called by Congress at request of 2/3 of states. Serious implications and fears of such a gathering. That system has never been used. Fear of a runaway convention that might get out of hand and start changing everything about the Constitution. And then disturbing country, will it stick to the matter at hand? Will they take on other issues? Who gets to be delegates? None of those things are explained. Okay, so ratification. So proposal, 2/3 from both houses, how it's done. Then Congress decides which shall be used under ratification. You can have 3/4 of state legislatures, all but the 21st have been done this way. And most state legislators ratify with simple majority, but some require supermajority, and states get to decide how they want to do that. And then the ratifying conventions in 3/4 of states, Amendment 21 is done this way. This is a more directly democratic way. People elect the delegates who state their positions. Citizens are in essence casting their votes on the amendment by voting for the appropriate delegates. And then there's a time limit for ratification, generally 7 years. The exception was the ERA, which was never ratified, but they extended it. That brings us to the end of part one. Again, take notes. Hopefully it'll go well for you. We can discuss in class. Thank you.